Welcome to Created Healthy. I'm Dawn Combs. It's a common idea that God gave us everything we need in nature, but do we believe it enough to walk that out in truth? Often the very same people who say this go looking for answers on how to use food and medicine from man-made sources. Everything man creates comes with a user's manual. Why would God be any different? I challenge you to join me in seeking revelation about our body, mind, soul, and spirit health by digging into His written word and in practicing pure science in the visible world of His creation. Yesterday, I started talking about the notion of what happens when we have been rebellious. We've gone our own way and walked miles away from the path that we were supposed to be on. And the notion that when we turn and start to head back to that path, that God meets us there. Here today in 1 Samuel 30 and 31, I think we're starting to see that with David. I think we're starting to see him turn. And maybe that moment of standing arrayed in battle lines, ready to go against Israel and being rejected because they recognized him as not of their own, maybe that shook him. Maybe that was a moment of realization. But as he turns to go back, he has created this sort of false kingdom. And maybe he was telling himself that he was being a king over all of the folks that he had gathered around him that were victims. And maybe he had talked himself into he was being good to these people and he was leading them. And he had built this civilization inside the Philistine lands, and it's called Ziklag. And as he's coming back from this moment in just before battle with the Philistines, he finds out that the Amalekites have raided Ziklag, where all of the men that he had taken with him to fight with the Philistines had left their wives and children and all of their livestock, and they find out that while they were away, leaving all of the people that they're supposed to care for vulnerable, that the Amalekites had raided. They burnt it to the ground, and they took all of the wives and children and livestock. The really cool thing here is that they took them all alive. And David immediately asks for the ephod and starts praying to God and asking for guidance. And God says, yeah, you need to follow them. I will give you the victory over them, and I will deliver all of those hostages back to you, every single one of them alive. David is starting to see here, I think, in a miniature where he's created this kingdom and he's quote-unquote king over it. He's seeing where he's left his people behind. And this is what I'm boldly suggesting, and please test this on your own. This is not something that I've ever heard anybody talk about or suggest, but this notion that David knew that he was lying and sparing Saul perhaps wasn't what God was intending him to do. All this time that David had left Saul as king while he was shirking his duty and not stepping into that, the Israelites were left with that sort of leader, with a crazy man who would throw a spear across a party at the harpist because he was jealous. That would lead men into battle for chasing somebody who he just had a personal feud with, who he was afraid of. This is the person that's leading Israel, and David has left his people, the people that God wanted him to shepherd. He had left them vulnerable to this sort of leadership. So this moment with Ziklag being burnt and all of the women and children being taken is, I think, sort of that first realization of what he's done. His next realization comes as they did, in fact, prevail over the Amalekites, and only 400 of them got away. And as the 600 men that he had taken with them, they had headed out 200 were so tired, and they sat down and waited. And 400 of them went on with David and slaughtered all of these Amalekites. And when they came back, the 400 showed themselves to be so greedy and so uncaring and unkind that they said anybody that didn't march with us doesn't deserve any of this spoil. They can have their wife and kids, but they can't have any of the livestock or goodness or riches. And David maybe starts to see that what he has surrounded himself with and what he has encouraged in his people through his own victimhood has created something ugly. And he goes against it and sends spoil to, not only do all of the men get spoil and their wives, but he sends it to the lands that had been plundered in Judah. So he is sending back to begin to take care of the larger Israel that he had abandoned. Here at the end of this reading, this is the end of 1 Samuel, and the Philistines are fighting Israel, and they do prevail over Israel as was foretold, but they do not rule over Israel. So they aren't going to win this battle and then take Israel's lands. There is just, which is interesting, right? Because most battles are fought. We've seen this problem with the Philistines for a really long time, and they finally win, and they kill the king. They kill Saul, and they kill all of his descendants, and they should have been able, you would think, to then turn and take over Israel, but that doesn't happen. And we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But there's this very weird scene where Saul is mortally wounded by an arrow, but it leaves him alive. And he knows that if the Philistines come and they get to him before he's died, they will abuse him, and that there will be torture, and there will be unreasonable suffering. And so he asks his armor bearer to kill him, and the armor bearer won't. Again, because he believes that Saul is the anointed of God. He doesn't know any different. And he's not about to raise his hand to someone that God anointed, even if it's to end his suffering. So all of Israel has continued to believe that God is with Saul. No matter what, they are believing that God is with Saul. And so Saul falls on his own spear, and the armor bearer kills himself because he's just watched the man that was given to them by God die. And so all of these people are killed on this mountain. And it makes me wonder, this scene is so weird. It's not a conquering situation where the king is cleanly killed. We have somebody who is weirdly left alive and has to choose to take his own life. And it feels very much to me like this wasn't God's plan. This wasn't where God had planned for Saul to end, but he needed to end. He needed to die. He needed to stop his sinning. He needed to be wiped off the earth. And so God allows this to happen. But unfortunately, Jonathan dies. And would this have been the ending? All of these people die. David loses his best friend, a brother, in this moment. And would that have had to have happened if David had just stepped into the very scary, very uncomfortable place when he knew he was anointed and it was time for him to take over from Saul because Saul had been deserted by God? If David had done it then, with Samuel alive to witness that this is indeed God's will and Israel needs to support this, and we all need to crown him as men on earth like God has crowned him already. If all of that had happened in the timing that God had originally set before David, and David made his own human free will choice to go another direction? Would we have seen Jonathan alive? Would we have seen Jonathan, who was a godly man? He was a powerful, godly man who encouraged David to focus on God's will and to be encouraged in God. Could Jonathan have been much more present in Israel? Maybe there could have been some repercussions headed off. But certainly this awkward death on the mountain, on Mount Gilboa, it just begs the question for me. Is this really what God had intended, or is this the consequence of what a man had decided would be better? And in doing so, in not facing Saul, in not challenging him because he didn't want to disrespect him, because he didn't want to admit that God had abandoned him, because he was afraid, did he consign Saul to this horrific death? And did he consign his best friend to die, and all of the other Israelites with them that didn't need to? Our actions and our choices have consequences, and this is a struggle as we go through, as we Christians face the Bible, as we face current events. It's a struggle for Christians to hold on to truth and to explain that God is a loving God, and God allows humans free will. He did not want automatons that would just worship him and never fight and never question. He wanted children that would turn to him and sometimes spit in his face, and sometimes be angry and question every single thing that he asked them to do. That's what I want in my children, and that's what God wants, because he wanted a real relationship. And unfortunately, when the free will happens and his children choose to go somewhere else other than the good path that he has put in front of them, when we don't trust that the uncomfortable, painful thing that we see on that path is going to be overcome by us because we are his children, he allows us to feel the consequences of our actions, because he is a loving God, and he allows us to choose, and he allows us to feel the ramifications that happen to us and to other people because of those choices. It's one of those bedrock things that is both difficult to grasp, and also it's mind-blowingly full of love. And it makes me feel truly free to know that my God will allow me to choose poorly and walk away from him for a long time, and then will welcome me when I turn back around and come back to him. So I pray that God is blessing you today. These last 3 podcasts have sort of been a unit. When I first started a few days ago trying to wrap my head around what I was really feeling here and hearing in these readings about David, it was so different than anything that I have ever heard. David has always been this amazing human, just so after God's heart and so perfect. But I think we truly see in these passages here in 1 Samuel why we have the book of Psalms. God allowed the book of Psalms to be preserved because David struggled and wrestled, and he had so much suffering because he had walked away from God. Even while he clung to God and loved God, he was making human errors that were separating him from God and causing his own issues. I pray that you are seeing those things in your life that are causing your own problems and to run back to the path that you are supposed to be on. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with a friend. And I'm always interested in hearing what God is laying on your heart. So drop me a rating or review, or join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at Dawn Combs Really.